First, let me say, as one of my last responsibilities in chairing this hearing, it couldn't be a more appropriate subject for today's hearing, the implementation of the Global Magnitsky Laws, and to have our two distinguished witnesses that are here. First, I want to thank the members of the committee for their cooperation during my term as chair of the committee. It's been an incredible honor. I want to thank Senator Risch for his cooperation. I want to acknowledge that why this is so appropriate is that when I was a freshman member of this committee, sitting where Senator Helmy is sitting today, I got engaged with the tragedy of Sergei Magnitsky. It was during that period of time that we were working with Bill Browder, working with Sergei Magnitsky, tragic circumstances of being imprisoned, and we wanted to do something about it. So I introduced the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act as a way of saying that we are going to hold abusers accountable, even if their own country does not. And I think the story is well understood. Sergei Magnitsky was a young attorney. He represented a client, discovered corruption, significant corruption, $230 million of tax revenues that were taken. He did what any lawyer is required to do, and that is reported it to the authorities. As a result of reporting it to the authorities in Russia, they arrested him. They encouraged him to recount his testimony. He refused to do that. They tortured him and murdered him. And we wanted to make sure there was accountability for that action. I could tell you we were encouraged by the greatest advocate I've ever met, Bill Browder, that this crime should not go without accountability. So we did something different in the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act. We imposed sanctions on the individual. Prior to that, we had a lot of country sanctions that would apply if a country did something that was wrong. We use it today, for example, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we have sanctions against Russia. When Iran violated their nuclear obligations, we have sanctions against Iran. But in this case, we have individual sanctions that really hurt the abuser because it prevents them from traveling to the United States or using our banking system, something that they want to do. They want to be protected by the rule of law, even though they're in countries that do not respect the rule of law. And it has worked. But the matter that we learned quickly, I think Senator Risch and I understand this very dramatically, it's up to Congress to take action. The executive branch is slow to respond to these types of circumstances. And it's been the legislative branch of government that has been the one that has responded with action. And Senator Risch, it was a person who held your position when I first came to this committee, Senator Lugar, who worked with me so that we could get the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law before our committee for a vote. And I will be always indebted to him. It's effective. It was so effective we decided to make it global and make it permanent. And I want to thank the late Senator John McCain, who was a real champion of the Global Magnitsky Law. It helped that he had the leadership position on the Armed Services Committee because we got it into the National Defense Authorization Act. And I want to thank also Senator Wicker for his incredible work in getting these laws passed. When U.S. leads, other countries follow, and we see now, thanks to our efforts and thanks to Bill Browder's efforts, 2 dozen countries have now passed Magnitsky-type sanctions, and it truly is the global standard for penalizing abusers for the actions that they have taken. So 7 years ago, the first sanctions under the Global Magnitsky Act included a former president of Gambia for his terror and assassination squad, a Pakistani insurgent leading an organ trafficking network, an Israeli mining executive who enriched himself with corrupt dealings costing the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the poorest nations in the world, more than $1 billion in revenues. And just this year, we've seen the Magnitsky sanctions used on a Cambodian businessman who trafficked workers into cyber scam mills that stole victims' money, 2 Georgians who encouraged violent attacks against protesters, journalists, and police officers, a former member of the Haiti parliament who helped form one of the most violent gangs in the country. These sanctions are being utilized, and they are working. And we can be very proud of the effort that this committee and the United States Senate has done in advancing these areas. Back to Senator McCain for one moment. It was his suggestion that we tighten the use of the Magnitsky sanctions against corruption. And he was responsible for expanding the sanctions for corruption. The Biden administration recognizes that corruption is a core U.S. national security interest. And we have passed in this committee the Combating Global Corruption Act, which is now the law of the land, thanks to my help of Senator Young, which now is a strategy to combat corruption by our missions around the world. So, to this hearing, yes, we can celebrate our success, but we need to talk about the future of targeted sanctions, how we can protect human rights defenders. I hope that we will see one day the enactment of legislation I've authored, the International Freedom Protection Act. It's passed our committee, and it may require some work in future Congresses, and I encourage my colleagues to keep a close eye on that bill and try to get it to the finish line. I also want to acknowledge one of Bill Browder's recommendations that we have 24 countries that have Magnitsky sanctions. Can't we coordinate this better? We've had several hundred individuals who have been sanctioned under Magnitsky, but there isn't a coordination among those nations that have Magnitsky-type sanctions. And I think it's incumbent upon all government officials. We have an obligation to advance policies that respect human freedom and the dignity of individuals. And this is especially true of those of us who live in democracies. It's our value-based foreign policy which distinguishes us from the autocratic countries of the world, and I think we have a responsibility to make sure that we can do this better. We have 2 very distinguished witnesses that I'll have a chance to introduce more with greater introductions, but just to acknowledge Adam Keith, who's a career of holding human rights abusers accountable, and Bill Browder, who was the client. His company was the client of Sergei Magnitsky, and he is the chief advocate for the passage of the Magnitsky sanctions here and around the world. And with that, let me yield to the distinguished ranking member, Senator Rich.